people. I want to talk a little bit before we get into some PowerPoint slides about what it is I do. I'm a freelance journalist. I write magazine articles and books. And I've been doing that since 1986. My office is at home. Working from home is not a new thing for me. But tonight I'm actually working remote. I did want you all to see my office, but there is utility construction in my part of Jefferson County, actually right out on my road frontage, and my internet connection there is extremely unstable. So I'm in a different spot tonight. I do want to let you know that I live in the Louisville area at the eastern edge of Jefferson County near the Shelby County line. I have a small farm there and I don't grow any crops or have any livestock. I manage it for the benefit of all of the native plants and animals. I always tell people that the deer were there before I was. So we're going to be talking about hummingbirds. My approach to everything is I'm curious. I ask a lot of questions. And then I like to share that information with other people. And so, although most people know me as a birder, and in fact on Twitter, I'm the friendly birder, uh, I do more than look at birds. I'm interested in habitats. So I'm looking at
Be careful
the
not.
plants, I'm looking at the insects, I'm thinking about geography, I'm thinking about geology, I'm thinking about the weather. And that's what we're going to be doing tonight. We're going to find out what hummingbirds need. What is a bird doing? Why is it in this habitat today? So we're going to talk about the hummingbirds that live with us for nesting during the warmer months. And the only species that nests in Kentucky is the ruby-throated hummingbird. Now, if you're from a neighboring state or pretty much anywhere in the eastern United States, all the things I'm going to talk about will be true for your location. And I heard someone earlier who mentioned that she lived for much of her life in Seattle on the west coast of the United States. And we'll talk a little bit about some differences when it's appropriate. When we get to the end, there will be time for question and answers. But let's enjoy some of these pictures that I've brought with me. That is an old picture. It's from about 20 years ago. And a hummingbird took a moment to rest on a branch of one of the bushes in my house gardens on the east side of the house. It's not a very flattering picture of a hummingbird, but I chose it for a reason, and we'll come back to it later on. Let's see if we can find something prettier. Aha! I think that's a good inspiration for us. This picture is from my friend Jeff. He and his wife Leslie have a garden in Union, Kentucky. That's Boone County, right across the Ohio River from Cincinnati. And I want to mention that in tonight's presentation, all the photographs are mine, unless I give credit to another photographer. So it is easy to attract hummingbirds to our gardens, and I will have some suggestions for cultivated plants later in the program. But now let's come back to me, because what I want to do is focus on the natural habitats that hummingbirds prefer and what they need. And when you can recognize these natural habitats, it'll help you enjoy it when you're exploring around our beautiful state. And it'll also help you know how to do things in your own garden. So I know we were talking earlier about who's had how much snow and all that sort of thing. I think we're all eager for spring to be here. So let's pretend that it's about the middle of April. And we're also going to pretend that we're a hummingbird. So let's think about what's going on in April. About the middle of April, the fields are greening up. The brushy layer, maybe up to about 10 feet tall along fence rows and so forth, is getting green. The trees are, some of them have unfurled a few leaves, and it's getting greener all over the place. So you're a male ruby-throated hummingbird. Where have you been? Well, for the cold winter months, they fly south and live in Central America, the Caribbean. I should note it, that they are tremendous flyers. They fly nonstop across the Gulf of Mexico. That's 600 miles. So the little ruby-throated hummingbird that you're pretending to be flying along, a few weeks ago, you got across the Gulf of Mexico, landed on the North American continent, and have been slowly making your way northward to Kentucky, where things are starting to green up. So you're flying along, and there's a ravine, and you see some green things down there, and you hear something. You hear some water dripping. Maybe it's coming from that ledge. Let's see slide number 3. You see a splash of color down there. Aha, it is a big splash of color. You zip down, remember you're still a hummingbird, and you're gonna zip down and hover in front of that splash of color. Now, as a bird, you don't know the name of this plant, but we call it columbine. And I want you to look at this and notice there's 2 distinct parts of the plant. There's the reddish part that's the petals, and then there's the yellow parts that are hanging down low. And so you get closer, and it looks like there might be some nectar in there. You need energy quick for all this flying around you've been doing. Let's come back to me and talk about what you as a hummingbird are going to do. Well, you're going to put your bill into that flower. Here you are, you're hovering, and you're going to put your bill into that flower, deep into the blossom. And sure enough, there is sweet nectar in there. But as you stick that long bill into the flower, you brush past the yellow parts of the plant that were hanging down. And pollen is going to stick right here on your forehead, and pollen is going to stick on your chin. It's going to get caught in your feathers in these 2 places. Now, you're sipping and thinking, would this be a good territory to live in? Well, that depends whether you can find more good plants with nectar. So they have to be within kind of a reasonable distance, and you start going farther up the ravine, or maybe you cross over to a different ravine. It is still kind of cold. Remember, we said it's mid-April, but you've got feathers to keep you warm, and you can go exploring in the dappled shade in these ravines. Let's see slide number 4, because you have found another splash of color. It's another columbine. And as you maneuver to reach the nectar in this plant, that pollen that's stuck to your forehead and stuck to your chin is going to pass over the yellow parts of this plant. The pollen will touch the pistil and it will fertilize the ovary and start reproduction for this plant this season. It's a perfect match. But how did this happen? Oh my goodness. The relationship between hummingbirds and plants goes far back in the mists of time. I should mention that hummingbirds only live in this hemisphere. There are about 300 species of hummingbirds alive today, and they live in South America, Central America, the Caribbean, and North America. There are about 16 species of hummingbirds that can regularly be found here in the United States. The majority of them are on the western half of the continent, and then there's some that just hang out along the Texas border and Arizona and New Mexico, way down south. So the ruby-throated hummingbird is the only one that breeds here in Kentucky. In the fall, we do get the occasional visitor, another species, but we're going to talk about the birds that spend more than 6 months with us here, and that's the ruby-throated hummingbird. Now, I have a fun fact about ruby-throated hummingbirds. If you'll go to slide number 5, which is also the one we opened with. But I chose it for a reason, even though it's not very flattering to the bird. You can see how tiny her feet are. And I do say her because, as I recall, this was a female ruby-throated hummingbird. The way to tell them apart is the male is the one whose feathers look red under the chin and throat. The female's feathers don't do that. But anyway, I want you to focus on how teeny tiny her feet are. How tiny, I mean, they're just so tiny. Their feet are so small, they don't use them to walk. If this hummingbird wanted to move farther out on that branch, she would not walk out the branch. What she would do would be fly up, move over, and fly back down, even just to move an inch, because those feet are so small, they're not meant for walking. They're meant for grasping a perch. And she can also use them, well, the male can too, to groom certain parts of her feathers. Now, let's get back to habitats for a minute. I think we've all seen those pollinator habitat zone signs at the side of the road. I drive past one several times a week in my neighborhood. And it's a pretty place. It's filled with all kinds of different flowers that, well, they kind of look like weeds, and some of them are, mostly yellow and white. And it kind of makes me think of a prairie. It's sunny there. So I have places like that at my own farm, and I walk around there a lot, several times a week. And the number of insects there is amazing. There are beetles and there are butterflies, and there's bees of all different sizes. And you might even see some wasps. It's full of insects. And they do a great job of pollinating in a place like that. And the flowers in a place like that make it easy for the insects to climb around on them and fly just a short little distance to the next plant. But here in Kentucky, we have a lot of different kinds of habitats, and they're not all sunny, and they're not all flat like a farm field, okay? So some of our plants are kind of shade-loving plants, and some of them do different things. So that's what I want us to think about, some of these hidden places. and the role that hummingbirds play. Now, we pretended to be a hummingbird to begin. Now, this may be even more appealing. We're going to pretend to be a plant, okay? What if instead of growing in one of those nice sunny fields as a plant, maybe you grow kind of far apart from the other plants of your species, maybe several hundred feet away? Or maybe you're a vine and you twist and climb and go up a tree trunk and you grow 30 or 40 feet up into that tree as a deciduous or woody vine. And so you're way high up above the ground. And it's kind of shady up there too, because you're twisting around where the tree leaves are. You could pretend to be another kind of plant. Suppose you're the kind of plant that grows at the edge of a marshy spot by a pond or near a lake, and it's cool in that shady spot. Or maybe you grow along the edge of a little creek or just a little trickle of water next to a limestone ledge, and it's cool in this shady spot, maybe 10 or 15 degrees colder than the other plants that are growing out there in that sunny field. What if it's foggy in the morning? What if there's a mist leaving little wet spots on your petals and your leaves in your secluded spot? I should mention that with insects, the optimal flying temperature for those insects that we found in that pretty sunny field is somewhere between 60 and 70 degrees. That's how warm it has to be for insect flight. Okay, so you're one of those plants. Maybe you don't need an insect. Maybe you need a different kind of animal to accomplish pollination. How about a bird? Would that be an improvement? Well, yes, it would. And there are several reasons for this. The main reason is birds can do a lot of things that insects cannot do. Birds are warm-blooded, just like we are. And what that means is they can regulate their body temperature regardless of the weather. They don't have to be in sunshine to fly. They don't have to warm up like an insect does before it can fly. Birds can fly just like that. Birds have another advantage. They can fly in light to moderate rain. And I'm sure in your own communities, you've noticed it. Blue jays and American crows are particularly visible even when rain begins. You'll see them flying around. And birds can do that when insects are crawling around and hiding under leaves because they don't like to fly. It messes things up for them in the rain. Hummingbirds can fly a lot longer distances than insects typically fly. And that's important. I don't know who's pretending to be one of those plants that lives far away from the others of its kind, but a hummingbird can easily fly 600, 1,000 feet to the next plant. That's not something many insects would do. So maybe you're pretending to be one of those plants that's the woody vine going up the tree. Well, a hummingbird can go up there 40, 50 feet up. Just that's easy. Whereas an insect might not go that high up. And there's one more nice thing about a bird. As a plant, when you rely on insects, the pollen gets on their feet and it gets on their wings and it gets on their faces and their mouth. It's all over the place. But with a hummingbird, you as a plant can be more particular. Remember, we said the pollen was going to stick on the forehead and it's going to stick on the chin. Okay. So that's another advantage. I want to take a minute and review the 4 reasons a bird pollinator is good, particularly a hummingbird. Number 1, it can move pollen earlier in the day. It doesn't have to warm up first. It's already warm, okay? Number 2, hummingbirds can fly in light to moderate rain when the insects have all gone hiding. Number 3, hummingbirds can fly much longer distances easily than insects can. And number 4, hummingbirds are more accurate for pollen moving. Forehead, chin, works great. Okay, I think that's a very impressive list. Let's keep on thinking about being a plant just for a few more minutes, okay? I want to remind you that nectar is not a part of sexual reproduction in plants. Sometimes I think of nectar as flirting, but actually scent is more the flirt part, and that's to attract insects. The nectar is more like a box of chocolates the morning after, okay? It's the reward for performing the pollination task. So you're a flower of one of these plant species that we've been pretending. How do you advertise to a hummingbird that you have indeed got nectar? What do? Well, first you want to use color. Red is highly visible to hummingbirds. Do you remember when we were talking about those pollinator habitat zones and I said there were a lot of white and yellow flowers? That's because white and yellow flowers are easily visible to insects, but we want to attract a hummingbird. So we're going to use red and mostly, and then we may use some other colors. We'll talk about that in a minute. Then we want to make our flowers accessible to the hummingbird. We'll talk a few minutes about how to recognize bird-friendly plants, okay? Now, plants that want to attract ruby-throated hummingbirds produce blossoms with these characteristics. The flowers are going to be dark orange, red, deep pink, possibly a dark purple, because those colors are highly visible to birds. The shape of the flowers are mostly going to be tubular, and they often protrude horizontally. They stick out from the supporting branch. They might angle down a little bit. Something else to look at in this photo, just excuse me for a minute. The flowers are spread out. They're not bunched too close together. If you want a hummingbird to come, your flowers, there should be enough room for the hummingbird to reach each individual flower without accidentally bumping into the next flower, okay? Now, earlier I said that the name of this plant is columbine, but you may know it as rock bells. That's because this particular plant often grows along the steep sides of limestone ravines. Now, do you notice how the blossoms hang downward a little bit? That's so that if it rains or if water drips from higher on the ledge, the nectar won't get diluted. Do you notice also that the two blossoms do not touch each other? There's enough room for the ruby-throated hummingbird's wings to beat as it hovers in front to drink nectar from one blossom without knocking into the next one. The wingspan of a ruby-throated hummingbird is only about 4.5 inches. Okay, that's basically the distance across your hand. 4.5 inches total wingspan. Okay, now here's another fun fact. Underneath those pretty little feathers that pretty red on the male's throat and that little tail that fans out with the little white marks on it, the real bird is really small. If you take your hand and I'm trying to do this on the screen, it's kind of funny. If you put your hand up and you've got your thumb pointing up to the sky, if you can bend your thumb just the last knuckle, okay, the distance from here out to here, that's all the bigger the hummingbird's body is. Just that big, so about an inch, okay? Now, I got another fun fact. All that bill, all those feathers, the tiny little feet, all of that little bird weighs only a little bit more than a copper penny, a coin, 1 penny. If you put 2 pennies in your hand, that's too much. About 1.5 pennies. And that's all that little bird weighs, but it has flown 600 miles across the Gulf of Mexico to get back to North America. I think they're pretty special. Now, let's go back to flowers and habitats. We can stop pretending to be a plant and just talk about some habitats. There's a place here in Louisville that I like to go to. It's called Putney Pond. And I like to go there to see what birds are there, all different times of the year. It's a small park, and it's probably 10 miles east of downtown Louisville and about a mile from Interstate 71. There are big, I mean, gigantic, really expensive houses nearby, and there's some pretty expensive condos nearby. And just a few hundred feet away from the part of the park that I like to go exploring in is US Highway 42 with thousands of cars going back and forth. All right, do you see any flowers here? Well, yeah, probably not. I was walking near the fence and I was looking at the brushy shrub layer. We've moved ahead. Earlier we were mid-April, now we're mid-June. And I was looking around and I caught a really quick glimpse of a ruby-throated hummingbird, but I lost sight of the bird. So I'm walking along the path. I'm looking up, I'm looking down, I'm looking left and looking right. Come back to me for a minute. I was looking for the bird, but I was also looking for something in particular, something that begins to be easy to see by mid-June, and that's the blossoms of trumpet vine. It's also called trumpet creeper, and it is a native plant to North America. In fact, the range of that plant extends all the way through Central America and into South America. It is a favorite with ruby-throated hummingbirds. Now, let's go to slide number 8 and see what I could see on that day in June. There we go. Do you see anything that might have nectar yet? Do you see maybe 2 orange blobs against that white tree trunk? Here's a better view of what you might see. Go to slide 9, please. This is trumpet vine blossoms. Now, those individual blossoms are typically 2 to 3 inches long, and the cluster of flowers might be 5 or 6 inches across. Do you notice something familiar? Is the color, shape, and arrangement of the flowers similar to the columbine? It's quite remarkable. This plant has rich, deep orange flowers. They're a tubular shape. They're spread apart for easy access. So we've looked at a spring flower, the columbine, and we've looked at a summer flower, the trumpet vine. What about autumn? What are the birds going to do? Well, last September, I was hiking at Cove Spring Park, which is in Franklin County, just on the outskirts of Frankfort. And I came across some plants at the edge of some woods. There was an open grassy area where the concrete path led towards the deep woods. And beyond the grass, at the edge of shady, woodsy part, I saw some plants. And this is what I saw over there and on the shady edge of Cove Spring Park. So this is a big patch of jewelweed, and it is one of the most important plants for hummingbirds in the fall. You may know this plant as touch-me-not because after pollination occurs and the seeds form, if a clumsy human or perhaps a deer walking along brushes against the plant, the seeds will shoot out like throwing grains of rice at a bread. It's pretty funny. Now, if you'll come back to me, please, there are actually 2 different kinds of jewelweed, and they both like damp ground, and Cove Spring Park is full of damp ground. And there's a stream and there's some ledges and all that sort of thing. So I kept on walking. I crossed a little wooden bridge over a stream and I got to the dirt path that leads up into the woodsy part by the creek. And I found more jewelweed. Let's have slide number 11 now so we can see what I found. This is yellow jewelweed. And there are 2 kinds of jewelweed. One is pollinated by insects and one is pollinated by ruby-throated hummingbirds. Here is the yellow one that is pollinated by insects. Do you see how close together the lower petals are? That's so an insect can easily walk toward the center of the flower. And the bees were all over the place. Next slide, number 12, please. And I almost got one in focus. They were so busy going from yellow flower to yellow flower. And as they landed and climbed onto and into the center of the flowers sort of sagged down from their weight. Now, there was also plenty of orange jewelweed, sometimes in masses like I saw at the edge of the woodsy spot, and then sometimes just a few plants here or there. This is orange jewelweed, which you will also hear called spotted jewelweed. And notice that there is a gap between the 2 lower petals. This plant wants to attract something bigger than an insect. In fact, it wants a ruby-throated hummingbird to help with pollination. This clearly shows the difference. And jewelweed, these are 2 separate species in the same genera of plant. Insects to the yellow, hummingbirds to the orange. And you can clearly see the difference. When the ruby-throated hummingbird puts its bill into the orange flower to sip nectar, the pollen will lodge on its forehead or its chin. And when it goes to the next orange jewelweed, some of that pollen will rub off and fertilize the plant to make seeds. And soon they'll burst forth to scatter on the ground, and the cycle goes on. By the way, I can mention later some of the other native plants that ruby-throated hummingbirds like to visit when they're here with us. They come in about mid-April, and they don't leave until the end of September, early October. Now, when I turned around at Cove Spring Park to walk back to my car, as I crossed over that little bridge, I saw a blur on my left, and something flew past me. And so I walked on over to the edge of the woods where I'd seen that big patch of flowers in the shade. And I watched and I looked. There it is. I found him. It is a male. You can't see the ruby part of his throat in this picture because for several reasons. But I did see it while I was watching the bird. The ruby colored flower, the red on its throat, the feathers are not red. It's a trick of the light. It's the way sunshine hits them and causes our eyes to see red. Okay, it's kind of like the effect with a rainbow. You know, the clouds are not really those colors, but it's a refraction of light. So I found him and I watched him go from flower to flower to flower. I was almost late for my lunch date because I was having so much fun watching this little bird. But hummingbirds do not come here just to drink nectar from our plants and pollinate them. Hummingbirds come here to mate and nest and raise the next generation of birds. Let's see. The next generation of pollinators. This is a ruby-throated hummingbird, a female on her nest. In order to mate and raise young, hummingbirds need more than nectar-rich plants. They need proper nest sites and nesting materials. The females come about a couple of weeks later than the males, and the female does all of the nest building with no help from the male. They sort of live separate lives, okay? She chooses an outer branch of a tree, often one that curves slightly downward. And very often she'll pick a spot where that branch leans, it's like a fork, you know, and maybe it might be in a sycamore or it might be in an elm tree. Very often near or actually over a small body of water. Now, as you may know as gardeners, sycamores grow along streams of any size, and they grow along riverbanks. But we have several elm species that can grow in damp ground and that like drier upland soils as well. So the ruby-throated hummingbird, those are the preferred trees, but they'll build a nest in something else that is similar to that. So let's look at that nest again and talk about the nest and its construction. I think it's just absolutely a marvel. The nest is usually maybe 10 feet above the ground or the water level, whatever. And because it's so small and the way it's disguised, it can be mistaken for a natural bump on the tree. It's really good. Look at the little bits of lichens that are attached all over the outside to help disguise it. Don't be surprised if it takes you a really long time to ever spot a hummingbird nest. Now, she builds her nest using all sorts of tiny little things, but a key feature is spider silk. She uses that to weave all the other stuff together. And when you look at that, there's tidbits of moss, there's lichens, there's bits of tree bark on the outside. There might be some pine needles stuck in there. She'll even get the tiny little filament. It's like a hair that carries a dandelion seed. She'll stick that in there too. The ruby-throated hummingbird has to really search. She's going to need a nice patch of woods with all those different materials available, or maybe not a full-fledged woods like acres and acres of woods, but maybe the edge habitat where the woods meet a field, or where there's an old fence line for a farm. Maybe someplace along some kind of little feeder creek, okay? And the key is that where she chooses along a creek or a riverbank or some kind of little stream is that it's left wild. It hasn't been cleared by humans. It's brushy and messy looking. And that would be just great if you're a hummingbird, okay? So she needs a place that she can find the nest materials. She needs a place where she can find flowers with nectar. And she also needs something else. This is another fun fact about hummingbirds. They don't live on nectar alone. They also need tiny, I mean really tiny little insects, particularly to feed their nestlings. And so she's got to have all of these different things besides just the plants with nectar. I've got another fun fact about hummingbirds. They don't need to drink water because they get so much liquid from the nectar. But they do need water for bathing. And they also, I mean, it's all about feather care. And so hummingbirds need free water, free flowing water, or what they really like, because they're such tiny little birds, is puddles. And they also will splash around in water that's left on a leaf after a rain. Some of you may know a wildflower called Indian cup. I don't know how to demonstrate it, but here's the plant stalk, and the leaf is sort of cupped around the plant stalk, and water will collect in that. And hummingbirds have been observed taking a bath in that. They'll even take a bath in our garden sprinklers. So let's talk about the things that ruby-throated hummingbirds need. If hummingbirds want nectar-rich flowers for energy, they need teeny tiny insects for some protein. They need a suitable nest site. They need the materials for nest construction, and they need water for bathing and feather grooming. So where are these habitats? Well, we've talked about some of them, and we've seen pictures of some of them. But ruby-throated hummingbird habitat will include intermittent streams or free-flowing streams along creeks, along the side of a river, maybe marshy or soggy ground near a pond or a lake. These habitats can be found all over our state. In rural areas, semi-rural areas, they can even be found in the suburbs like Putney Pond, with all those big expensive houses just a couple of 100 feet away. If some of the natural areas have been left alone. You saw at Putney Pond, there was an asphalt path and there was a 4-board horse fence, just because people love horse fences, even though there aren't any horses there. But basically it was wild looking. There was the shrubby area and the big trees. So that is the kind of habitat that appeals to a ruby-throated hummingbird. And now that we've explored those, what I'm hoping is that you will be sort of a hummingbird ambassador back in your local community and be able to be a voice for these tiny, remember, they're only as big as the last joint of your thumb. Be a voice for them and tell humans about the kind of habitat they need. And maybe we can keep them coming back to us. They're just so pretty and fun to watch every summer. I think that would be great. And you can tell your friends what they need. And now that you know the things they need, you can incorporate some of those features into your gardens. And so it's just fun to see these cute little birds and to provide them the flowers and the other materials they need. If you would like for me to give this talk to a group in your community, I'm available. I'd be delighted. And I do book some engagements directly. I also am a member of the Kentucky Humanities Council Speakers Bureau. And you can find out more about this at my website. And this slide has all my contact information. Now you can jot a note, you can take a screenshot, and Janine has this. You can send her an email and she will give you all this stuff. Or you can just go the direct route. If you Google Nancy Grant, I'm probably going to come up as either number 1, 2, or 3 in your results. Now, if we were together, I would have already been talking about something else near and dear to me, and that's my newest book. It's called Binge Birding, 20 Days with Binoculars. And in it, I describe a road trip I took, a solo road trip, all down the Texas Gulf Coast. I drove almost 4,000 miles by myself, and I investigated all kinds of habitats along the way. And yes, I did see some other kinds of hummingbirds, and that I tell about that in the book. Now, if we were together in the same place tonight, after we finish questions and answers and do some socializing, I would have copies of the book to sell and autograph for you, kind of like this. However, we're not in the same room, but you can still buy my book because it's on sale at Amazon. It's on sale at Amazon in the United States and 8 other countries. I was checking this morning. I had 2 more buyers in Great Britain, and another person is reading my book in Germany. It is in English, in all the places it's offered. There are links at my website and my Facebook page to buy the book directly at Amazon. Or you can just go to Amazon and type in the title. I want to thank you again for inviting me this evening to talk about birds. I love them. I can watch birds any place, anywhere, anytime. Now I'm ready to answer your questions, and Janine is going to help us so that we're not talking over each other, and she'll recognize someone who has the first question. Go ahead, please.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Nancy. That was just delightful, and I learned an awful lot. That was great. There are a
Well,
couple questions in the chat, and I'd like to start with them.
all right.
What are the best type of flowers to attract hummingbirds? I have bought some long-throated bloom plants, but is there any others? And that's from Jennifer.
All right. Well, I can tell you, I begin with some of the plants I've had success with in my own gardens. And I should mention again that I'm in the outskirts of Louisville. My elevation is different though. I'm up on a kind of a ridge, so my elevation is about 670 feet. So it gets a little wonky with that zone 7 stuff. But the plants that, and I should also mention, if you're going to grow in my yard, you better be good at growing all by yourself, because I'm not going to be doing much for you. But one thing that is really successful, oddly enough, is butterfly bush, Buddleia, and particularly the purple varieties. Now, I know the flowers, the individual flowers on a stalk of butterfly bush are tiny, but grouped together, you know, the wand of flowers can be up to a foot long, and all that mass of color is attractive. And I've watched ruby-throated hummingbirds come and poke their tongues in each one of those little tiny blossoms. Another plant that works well in my area is hosta, the ones that have the dark purplish blue flowers, not the ones that have the white flowers. Hosta can be a problem if you live amid deer, like I do. So the hosta are in a section of my house gardens right near where the air conditioner compressor is, because the deer don't like the noise, the random noise of that. Another plant that works good, can work good, is common lilac. And although it's considered really kind of an invasive thing, mimosa trees will attract hummingbirds, but you may be thinking you want something short, maybe in the 4 feet and under thing for around your garden. Other things that work well are Beebalm, Monarda. A lot of plants in the mint family are attractive to hummingbirds. And if you think about how the blossoms are shaped on mint plants, you'll see why that would be true. Fuchsia, which is often sold in hanging baskets in Kentucky, hummingbirds will investigate that too. The other things, sage, a red salvia can work. And there is a plant that I did not talk about, a native plant called the Cardinal Flower, that is very attractive. And sometimes you can get cultivars of that. Speaking of cultivars, I want to warn people, trumpet creeper, trumpet vine is sold in garden centers. The cultivar of that is called Madam Galen, Galen. And it comes in a little pot about this big with this cute little trellis made out of popsicle sticks. And you buy that and you think, oh, that's so cute. I'm gonna plant that right by the house. Don't do it. Trumpet vine, even the cultivar, is a native plant, and it is a deciduous vine, and given the right soil and growing conditions, that vine will be as thick as your wrist. Now, it can pull gutters off your house, and it can collapse a PVC trellis. I've got the pictures to show it, okay? So if you want to have trumpet vine in your gardens around your house, or maybe your place of business or something, you need to build a really sturdy structure, like a pergola or something like that, to support that vine. Because if you try to go with just like little wooden thing, you know, skinny little thing, it's going to tear it apart. But those are some good choices for gardens.
Okay.
Is there another question?
There are several, yes.
Okay.
How long does it take the hummingbird to fly to the Caribbean? Donna would like to know.
Oh, well, to fly over the Gulf of Mexico from North America, either to the Caribbean or to angle across the Gulf to hit the top of South America or Central America. It's a nonstop flight. There isn't anything in between. And it takes, I want to say, maybe around 18 hours or so. It varies. I would really have to look that up. And it gets complicated with crosswinds or storms. You know, can blow them off course, and so, but they try to take advantage of some of the wind currents. But when they land, when they make landfall in Florida or Alabama or Louisiana, Texas, the birds are exhausted. The flight has consumed so much of the interior of their body for that sustained flying all that time period that they are exhausted. And they spend quite a bit of time along the Gulf Coast drinking nectar and replenishing their bodies. And then they start making shorter leaps coming up to Kentucky. What's the next question?
Mary wants to know, is there a particular time of the day to capture a picture?
Well, hummingbirds are active pretty much throughout the day because of their high energy needs. They have to drink nectar at regular intervals. They digest it very quickly, and then they have to replenish it. So they might sip some nectar, and 20 minutes later, they're sipping nectar again. It's different from some of our songbirds that eat insects and they gobble them up in the morning. And then around noontime, they kind of have a lull in activity. So hummingbirds, you can see them throughout the day. For good photographs, what you want to be thinking about probably is the early morning hours or the late afternoon hours. Sometimes at midday when the sun is directly overhead, it causes weird shadows and you don't get a pretty picture. But one other tip is to pre-focus your camera on a flower that you think a hummingbird is going to come and visit and already be ready. And then when the hummingbird comes, then you can click the shutter.
I have a blind. I'm a amateur photographer, and I love photographing birds. And I've been doing hummingbirds with other birds for years and years. Yeah. But my husband got me a blind a couple years ago, and I'd set that up so I could get closer to them. The funny thing is, they would come and they would hover. I have a great big long lens. They would hover right in front of me, just 2 inches from my lens, saying, "I know you're in there."
Yeah,
you know, they look at me right in the blind, and it was just tormenting me.
Yeah.
They're funny.
They're fun little birds, fun little birds. Hummingbirds, like a great many birds, do not have very well-developed sense of smell. Now, there are exceptions to that, but hummingbirds rely on vision, not their sense of smell. Yes, they can smell, but that's not the important thing. It's vision. So it's the red color or the dark orange or the rich, deep purple that gives the hummingbird the idea, oh, there might be nectar over there, because they associate those colors with nectar. And for those of you who live in rural areas, this was a weird thing that honestly happened. When electrified fencing came in, the little round insulators that go between the electrified wire and the fence post, when those began to be mass produced, those things were red and hummingbirds were getting electrocuted. So if you go along a country lane and you see electric fence, look and you'll see that the insulators are now yellow instead of red. The things that you need in your backyard would be similar to what you need in a natural habitat. So you want a nectar source, that would be those plants we talked about. And then you would want places for the bird to perch or possibly build a nest. So you need, just like any garden, you want different levels of interest in a garden. You want things down low and things kind of medium and things over here. So you would want that. And you would want some sort of water source if you can do that. One of my friends who may be in this group tonight has a water bubbler thing that her husband made. It water constantly does that. And that would be useful to a hummingbird. And also you want your gardens to include plenty of insect habitat and also spider habitat, because the hummingbird needs those insects to feed nestlings and needs spider silk to build the nest. So you need to just make it as natural as you can in the space you have, and not break any homeowners association rules or things like that, And there is also good opportunities for parks in wherever it is that you live, to tell the park managers, whether it's the county or the city, or, yeah, sure, we know you got to have the sports fields. Everybody likes that. How about, could we leave a little wild place over here on the edge? And that will help to attract hummingbirds. It is a native plant, so it belongs here. It is fine to have it. But another nickname for that plant is devil's shoelaces. And the reason for that is because it's growing up this support, like a tree or something. And then it's got all these tendrils coming out this way, trying to find another support. And that, in fact, has happened around the trellis that now is wrecked, where I put the cultivar. And I have to be careful when I'm going around the other plants in that area, because the vine goes along the ground. And I have some men who work for me to keep the mowed parts mowed. And if I didn't have that mowed off short, that vine would be growing up somewhere else, But on my acreage, the plant grows down by my pond and is pretty much, that's a wild plant. I didn't put that there. It grew there all by itself. And that's by the pond. And then out in the remains of the front hayfield in the left woods, there is trumpet vine growing up one of those trees. And that is, the flowers are, I would say, 50 feet above the ground. But it's not like taking over the way kudzu would or something like that. I do not have artificial feeders of any kind at my land. when my family was younger, I had a hard enough time feeding the humans and the pets. And I just do, habitat. Okay. But my friends who have hummingbird feeders talk about the territorial issues often. And I also see this a lot in many of the groups I'm in. And if you can afford to keep more than one hummingbird feeder filled with nectar, then I strongly encourage it. And they need to be spaced far apart. Do you remember when we were talking earlier tonight about how the native plants that use hummingbirds as their pollinators are widely dispersed through the habitat and the environment? And that's a good thing to keep in mind if you're going to do artificial feeders, is to have them as far as practical apart. And some people have even put them on two sides of their house so that the dominant hummingbird doesn't see the other hummingbirds on the other area and try to drive them off. There's a reason for the behavior. It's not bullying. It's not being mean. It has to do with protecting a resource. And that's so, yes, multiple feeders is a good solution to the problem. The reason that territorial behavior gets so aggressive in the fall is because the birds are tanking up to fly back across the Gulf of Mexico. And they're going to protect their nectar sources from intruders who may be, in fact, coming from Northern Ohio, Northern Indiana, whatever. And they're like, hey, Buster, I found this stuff first. So that's why you see that behavior in the fall. Well, I don't think it's a question of either or. You should be able to have both. If you have a convenient location on your deck where maybe you can watch from inside the house, or hummingbirds get pretty accustomed to humans and they do associate us with food. If you sit quietly, maybe 10 feet away from your feeder, the hummingbirds will come to it and you can enjoy watching them at the feeder. But then maybe you've got a place out in your yard where you could have some nectar-rich plants as well. Because hummingbirds, one of their behaviors is they run a trot line. It's like fishing. And in a hummingbird's territory, that particular bird will know where the plants that are producing nectar this week are. And the hummingbird will go along and drink from all the different sources, just like a fisherman with a trot line will go and pull up the bait and okay, we got a fish here, and then go, 30 feet away. Oh, look, we got another one. So that the behavior of hummingbirds, if you have an artificial feeder and some plants, you got two places to watch the bird.
And I wonder if we're interfering with their natural ability to be pollinators if we have them using the feeders all the time instead of using the natural plants.
I hear
Are we aiding and abetting a bad behavior?
I hear this question often, and not just about hummingbirds, but people who put out seeds for the seed-eating birds. And it helps to think of it that you're supplementing their natural foods and behaviors. You're adding a little extra for them. And in certain parts of town or certain parts of the state, that supplemental feeding may be of greater importance if the wild things have been destroyed. Okay. And so I don't notice And I don't think there's really any other anecdotal evidence that it is interrupting natural behavior. It is supplementing it. Now, I will say that hummingbirds are extremely smart, and they have learned at some houses that if you hover in front of the window long enough, somebody is going to say, oh, I forgot to fill the feeder and go out. Okay, they know this because they come and do this thing in front of my windows. And I'm like, buddy, you're at the wrong house. You know, they also are attracted to anything red, rich red. Well, every house I've ever lived in, we painted the front door Chinese red because we like it, you know. And the first year hummingbirds, I can just sit on my front porch and watch them and I go, yep, that's a newbie, because it'll come and hover in front of the front door because it sees that red. And then it goes, oh, wait, that's not a flower. And then it goes on, you know. So they know us, but I don't think we're interfering with their behavior.
Could you speak to the impact of pesticides and herbicides on hummingbirds population?
Well, I do not have any statistics to share about declines or increases in local populations. I do not have any facts to back up anything I would say. But the use of pesticides is highly regulated. And in fact, a great deal of the discussion during statewide pollinator stakeholder meetings has to do with the correct application of pesticides and all of the kinds of farms and all this stuff, because they're regulated substances. But mistakes happen, and that is dealing with professionals who are employed by parks or county or city governments who know they have to follow the rules. Individual homeowners, gardeners, whatever, can go down to the big box garden shop and pick stuff off the shelf, and they may misuse it. And that can injure birds. It can injure the insects you want, not just the ones you're trying to kill. So the use of pesticides has ripple effects as well. What I usually end up talking about is rodenticides, the things people put out to kill mice and rats, and that works its way up the food chain to hawks and kills hawks in certain concentrations. And again, this is often caused by people who do not read the rules and do not understand all that. That's a subject for another day. But I would urge caution. And that kind of, it's a very complex issue. And the more knowledge people have, then the better it is, and the less likely that the products that are approved for home use are not used improperly. And the products that are approved for commercial use, those folks have to follow an enormous set of rules, and you keep your fingers crossed that they do it right. And I do have some other plant suggestions. We talked about the butterfly bush. If you have room for lilac bushes, that's good. I've been told, I don't have personal experience with this, but I've been told that crabapple trees are attractive to hummingbirds. And for vines, morning glories, particularly the ones that have the dark colors rather than white, are attractive to hummingbirds. And this is, again, I have no personal experience with this, but people tell me that scarlet runner bean is attractive to hummingbirds. Somebody try that this summer and tell me if it works, okay?
I had success with zinnias.
Well, now it's interesting you bring up zinnias, because there's also Mexican sunflower and tithonia.
Yeah.
It's also sold as tithonia. The hummingbird, I have a huge covered porch on the front of my house and a huge deck on the back of my house. And the hummingbirds will look at the red zinnias, okay? And they'll look at them and they might stick their tongue in there once and then they go somewhere else because there is not enough nectar there to make it worthwhile. Zinnias are a composite in the same family as sunflowers and daisies, and they don't produce great amounts of nectar. It's really not worth the hummingbird's time to hover in front of that because it's just going to get such a tiny bit of nectar. It needs to go somewhere else. I have enjoyed this. I do wish we were in the same room together, but I think we did pretty good with this. We've enjoyed this time together. I'm very easy to find. And I would appreciate if you take a look at the information on my website about my book. And I will be glad, as I said, to speak to any group that you think would like to know more about hummingbirds. So thank you. I'll say good night.
Thank
And
you.
good birding to everyone and good gardening. Gosh, I hope you'll have lots of pretty flowers this year.
Yes, Nancy, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really enjoyed your presentation.
Well, thanks, Donna.
Very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All right.